Hey guys, Yonas here. Don't forget to click down below to like and subscribe for more card game content. Thank you guys for your continued support, and I hope you guys enjoyed today's video.
Let's see what each player decided to keep. Let's look at first the Shanks opponent's hand. In this matchup, I imagine you just want to find every single, or the first 5 cost character. There are 8 of them, but the fact that none of them are searchable, you might just want to have to mulligan towards those and just hope the rest of the curve pans out. Alongside that, obviously, the 8-cost Dragon is probably one of your best cards in this matchup. A lot of pressure relatively quickly before the Lucci player wants to get set up. Whereas the Lucci player is probably looking a lot towards just having KOs towards big characters. And going first, this is kind of exactly what the Shanks player is looking for. That first threat of the 5-cost ace, which is hard for them to get rid of, alongside Ben Beckman to play on their 5-dawn turn and a dragon to play the turns afterwards, means that this hand's really geared towards being aggressive. Not much counter, but usually you can get away with not having that much counter in this matchup, so I'm actually pretty happy with this kind of hand. Whereas the Lucci player, when going second, does have a 3-cost Brook to play while also swinging 6 and a 5-cost Kaku, which might be relevant. But your first clears aren't going to be spectacular with this kind of hand, but your late game clears are pretty good between the Moria and the Kaido. So this is a speculative keep, but I think it's a decent keep to have. And let's just get started. Alrighty, yep. Shanks doesn't really tend to play anything on its first couple turns, whereas Lucci doesn't plan to do much either, but I think that Lucci needs to kind of get a lot of things on board relatively soon to kind of force Shanks to do a little bit more scary things. Shanks swinging 7 is very standard on these first couple turns, and Lucci can almost never counter out of it. It tends to get a lot of equity countering out of the leader swings the next couple turns afterwards. Setting up a Brook here is actually super powerful, as long as it doesn't get like snapped by a Gum Gum Red Hawk to KO 4K characters. It's a really good tool to make sure that none of the small characters live anytime soon. And as expected, the Brook ended up getting in there. And Shanks is going to obviously just swing 5 and play that ace almost always here. The Lucci player kind of knowing that it needs to counter out of a lot of the early 5s, because it won't really get that many opportunities once the big rushers like 10-cost Shanks or 8-cost Dragon come into play. So great foresight by the Lucci player to make sure that happened. Going into this turn, it's kind of hard to figure out what the best course of action is. You can choose to be relatively proactive and play a card like Sabo. Getting an extra blocker to block some future 5k swings is probably your best bet, and you probably just don't want to do anything else. You could play Lucci as an attacker, but you might just want to have that in your hand for later. I'm curious what he's planning on doing this turn. I'm surprised he just didn't swing 6 with his leader instead of doing this. He could try to get the double KO on the ace. I just don't really feel like this is a great use of your Ice Ages. This matchup kind of boils down to a lot of the early or like late game characters like Shanks, like Rogers, Dragons as well, and the Ice Ages tend to be really critical tools to get rid of them. So kind of using your only Ice Age is a bit hasty in my opinion, but you got to clear everything super early, which is going to buy you a ton of time. This also gives you a lot more time to just play more defensive plays throughout the match, so you actually won't lose too much when you do this. Yep. The Shanks player is just going to repeat the same process, just keep deploying relatively obnoxious characters to remove, but at the cost of kind of explore or being more explosive with a card like Ben Beckman, which is like going to clear the board, be a lot more powerful, but is more susceptible to being removed. This turn from the Lucci player, they have a few options. One is just like be a little defensive with the Sabo, or just like play your Moria on your 8-dawn turn. For me, my gut is telling me that I probably would just prefer to play the Moria. The problem is you don't really have a better turn for your Moria. You kind of wasted your only event. So from my side, it makes more sense to just be very proactive, which is kind of what your previous turn was doing, being proactive with your threats, like Lucci. But now you're taking a much more defensive route with this Sabo, which I'm not a huge fan of. I think if you just play the Moria and just bring back a Brook and a Spandam, regardless of whether that Spandam gets an extra card, it kind of buys you a lot more time. But now that we're doing this, we have a bunch of Tempest Kicks now, which is pretty nice. You don't need the Akos Kaku either, and you probably don't need the Spandam when you have the Rebecca in your hand. So we kind of have a bunch of really good KOs the next couple turns lined up, which is very nice, but our hand is very counter-light, which might end up biting us. These next couple turns basically just are going to have to be playing Morias or Kaidos to eliminate threats, and we might not be able to survive the onslaught of big swings until then. Alright. The Shanks player probably just playing Dragon here. Now that he established a character, he gets to do a really powerful play of swing 7, and then swing 9, which is definitely scary in the face of this. What was the card that we just found in life? I can't tell what that card next to Tempest Kick is. Oh, is that just another big character? Okay. Well, 779 is really scary here when we don't have any of the 2Ks, which is kind of the concern of just like not deploying your big characters. Because when this happens and you end up taking 3 life in a turn like we did here, there's always a concern of just being rushed down. And you don't have even enough time to play all of your characters. Also, that card was Jack. I didn't recognize the CS art, but that thing is gorgeous. Yeah, now here we're going to our first Tendon turn, and I think we're kind of priced into playing a big character. We can play the Kaido and just get rid of the Dragon, which will require very minimal costs. The problem is we only have the 1-2K, so a lot of the time we're going to have to counter out of one of these big swings, and then just like block with our Sabo and let it go away with the other, which is not going to feel like the best play in the world. I think that last turn was probably one of the critical ones that made it that Lucci was on the back foot and gave the the Shanks player way too much time to set up. The Shanks player kind of countering relatively aggressively. It knows that he has the upper hand, and he doesn't want to give Lucci any opportunity to kind of catch back up by taking a bunch of life. They've unfortunately run out of 2Ks though. You don't have infinite counter, and the original hand we kept had 2 Rayleighs, which don't seem kind of in line with what this hand wanted to do. So, yeah, definitely have to start with these Tempest Kicks just to make sure that we're actually having sufficient counter for when these large swings come up. Double Tempest Kick seemed like a bit of a waste. You didn't need to use both Tempest Kicks to get rid of the Dragon, since we have Tsuru, Spandine, and Lucci in our trash. However, like since you don't have a Rebecca, since you didn't end up pitching one to the Sabo a couple turns ago, it makes this play a lot scarier. Now the Shanks player, since he chose not to play a Moria last turn and didn't have a Rebecca in trash this turn, he kind of has to spend a whole extra turn doing relatively defensive plays, which doesn't feel amazing ever. Additionally, he ended up choosing to take Brook from his trash instead of Spandine off the second Rebecca to get extra counter. I probably would have taken the Spandine here, not because like having a different 1K is all that relevant, but I do think a lot of the time when you get in these late game spots, you need to get a 2K back with your Rebecca, and sometimes you also need to use Rebecca to bring back a Spandine. Or to bring back Spandine plus Lucci. So if you ever bring back a Spandine preemptively, your future Rebeccas can bring back 2Ks, which might end up being beneficial in the long run. On this turn with Shanks, just Rayleigh, now that the Shanks player has established so much pressure, kind of gotten a lot of threats to stick, he can kind of just coast with what he has in case this 5-cost Marco and keep getting cards out of their hand. 6/6, leaving up the Radical Beam. The Shanks player, like we've mentioned before, is relatively light on counter, but also has plenty of events to leave up. So using it this turn and kind of mitigating any possible chance of the Lucci player racing back is probably the smartest thing to do. Yep. Additionally, from my perspective, it's kind of pretty obvious that the Lucci player has to play Moria next turn. However, we kind of chose not to block with either Rebecca this turn. I forgot about that. The Shanks or the Rayleigh's effect of being or -3King the Lucci is also very relevant here. It makes it even harder for the Shanks player to apply any or to take any damage, because a 5k and a 4k body aren't really going to do anything in the face of Shanks' leader ability. If that was the case, I probably would have done a 7 with the Shanks last turn. The radical beam isn't really that necessary here. Now we get to just use leader ability and pitch a 1k. Oh, we went 7 at the Marco? That doesn't make too much sense. I probably would have just done it at life. I think the Shanks player has to counter with the same level of hurt, or like same like egregiousness. They have to counter the 5k and the 6k kind of the same, so you might as well get the extra 2k, especially since you have to tax their 2k so much in this matchup. And the Lucci player is kind of falling within this extremely defensive spiral that it's really easy to fall into when you're playing Lucci, but it's mostly a losing play, is when you have to keep playing blockers before you set up any big characters. The last couple turns from the Lucci player side has been Rebecca, and then Sabo this last turn. And because of that, the Shanks player doesn't really have any threats that they have to deal with. There's not really much pressure they have to deal with, because just one character is really easy for Shanks to kind of mitigate. And now what the Shanks player has the 10 cost they can play this turn, these 4 cost bodies and these like 6k bodies are even more irrelevant. So now Shanks gets to swing 8 with the Rayleigh, just try to make it relatively obnoxious for the Shanks player to block. One small thing is that after a while, it doesn't really make too much sense to swing with the 8k first, just in case your opponent wants to go block 2-1. It's not very likely it'll happen, but now that he played the 10 cost Shanks, now that the Sabo's a 5k body, the Shanks player correctly identifying that he can't even block with the 6k blockers, so it makes a lot of sense to play that before you swing with your leader. 6k swing when the Lucci player only has 2 1ks is a nightmare. Giving these 2 1k swing or to counters basically is the Moria, or not the Moria, the Lucci player kind of resigning to that this is going to be my next turn or my last turn of the game. If when your Moria or your Lucci opponent only has 2 cards in hand and a life, a lot of the time they can never survive the turn afterwards. Even with a Moria in this matchup, you're not going to survive. There's too many large characters. You don't have anything to kind of keep attacking with to attack the board. So this is kind of your last turn. And because of that, the Shanks opponent kind of has a difficult decision whether it wants to attack the board or attack life. I think attacking the board there is really smart, because when you have to counter with 2 1ks there, you're dead next turn no matter what a lot of the time. So might as well minimize the chances that you lose, especially when your hand only has 2 cards with counter. It's not very likely you lose because there's 2 3k bodies when there's a 10 cost Shanks in play, which is really hard to work with. There is a 5k body now with the Shanks, but with 2 life, it's so difficult for Lucci to go for it. And somehow the Lucci player does have a relatively good clear this turn. Ice Age plus Moria is like surprisingly powerful here. You gotta reduce the Shanks to a 9. The Ice Age can reduce it to a 4, and now the Moria is kind of perfect. It gets to go Rebecca, or the full combo, Rebecca, Helmet Bow, or in this case I believe it's Suru, and then Spandine Lucci, getting rid of the really scary 10 costs. But that's kind of all it's doing, to be completely honest. It's not really doing anything else. And yeah, this is a turn that's perfectly fine. The problem is it's still difficult for the Shanks opponent to lose this turn or next turn. The 10 cost is gone, and there are 2 blockers in play, but the fact that the second Rayleigh still exists, and the fact that Lucci can't even realistically attack with this Sabo out of fear of this losing with 1 card in hand, makes it relatively easy. And we drew a 5 cost Marco. So if the Shanks player wants to go for game, I think they can. But it kind of depends on what the preferences are. Based on the 6k swing, it doesn't seem like that's what the plan is. I think the plan is probably just Rayleigh and then swing 6 with the Shanks and the Marco. So because of that, I think it's like relatively easy. There's also the lime juice. The lime juice can make sure that a 4-cost character can't even block this turn, or a 4K blocker can't even block this turn. So, and since the fact that the Rebecca didn't block on the swing, now we get to just swing with Rebecca, or swing with Rayleigh and Shanks, and 9K and 9K are going to be good there. Well,